Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Cotidianul TV Campus, today with a very special guest from Australia, Professor Paul Foley. Welcome, Paul. How are you?
I'm quite good, thank you. How are you?
Fine, thank you. What time is it in Sydney now, if I may ask?
Just coming up to 6 in the evening, so I've just finished work for the day.
Thanks for joining us here on Cotidianul TV today with a very special subject, maybe something very few people ever heard about. It's called Encephalitis Lethargica. Paul, please explain to our audience, since you are one of the most famous experts in the history of this very seldom but not unusual disease, what is it about?
It was a very mysterious disease. First arose, we think, in Europe around about 1915, 1916, in modern terms, of course. Most diseases have been around forever, but they have to be discovered and they have to be described. But in 1916, at Christmas time in Vienna, Constantine von Economo, a very interesting Austrian neurologist who was on leave from being a reconnaissance pilot for the Austrian Air Force during World War I, happened to notice a bunch of patients in Vienna who all shared similar symptoms. They were sleepy, they had a sort of catatonia about them. They didn't seem to have much to link them otherwise, and most of them died very soon after he'd seen them. It's considered a mark of genius that just walking into a hospital and he saw these patients on different wards, realised who they were, that they consisted of something new and something different, but the same thing. He did some brain autopsies, found they all had the same neuropathology in the brainstem, which confirmed what he'd suspected from the first place. And presented a paper to the Viennese Medical Society in early January. And he gave it the name Encephalitis Lethargica. Encephalitis because it was an inflammation of the brain. Lethargica because sleeping seemed to be the most consistent and the most prominent feature of the disorder. And the interesting thing is, he described this within a month of seeing a handful of patients, a dozen patients. And over the next 20 years, when people saw thousands of patients, nobody had to correct him. He was correct right from the start. And that's what I find amazing. He wasn't a doctor who had access to a great laboratory or lots of tests. He relied purely on what he saw, talking to his patients, asking how they felt, how they were connected to each other, what they did. And he put it all together like a jigsaw puzzle and got it right first time.
I'd like to point out for our audience, it's Cotidianul TV is a Romanian media station. Economo was Romanian born. He was born a descendant of a Greek family born in Brăila in Romania before he moved during the Austrian-Hungarian Empire to Trieste, and I think he studied in Vienna.
In
Vienna. Paul, you're a researcher at the Neuroscience Research Australia and also the deputy medical editor at the Medical Journal of Australia, which is also based in Sydney, New South Wales. Could you tell us something? How did you come across this very special and unique disease? What motivated you to do research and engage in research on that subject?
Partly because of my love for the European attitude that the history of a disease is as important as the disease itself, because we learn more about the disorder, we learn more about the people who have it. I'm actually retired from actual laboratory research now, but originally I was working in the laboratory investigating dopamine in the brain, and my main focus was Parkinson's disease. And I originally wrote a book while I was in Germany for a while there on the history of the treatment of Parkinson's disease. And most people think, well, that goes back to 1960, the discovery of L-Dopa, and before that it was all barbarians and we put people in hospitals and didn't look after them. And that, of course, is not true. We've been seeing Parkinson's disease since Hippocrates was a young man. And people have tried many things, and a lot of things have worked over the centuries, which were actually used until the 1950s and into the 1970s. But what was interesting was that I came across this disease in the 1920s, where young people developed Parkinsonism, And that was a shock for the system, both at the time and for me, because Parkinson's disease, as we all know, and I put no one in inverted commas, is a disease of the old. But here were teenagers, people in their 20s, suddenly having Parkinson's disease, and it didn't make sense. But what this stimulated at the time, particularly in the advanced countries like Germany, like England, like France, was a bigger search for cures. And so I kept reading about Encephalitis Lethargica over and over again. But then, of course, I thought, diseases don't come and go. Diseases come and they stay, even if we don't recognise them. What happened to Encephalitis Lethargica? And so I went on to do some more historical research, which eventually turned into a overly sized book, which I'm now revising to a more moderate size for readers, which traced the history of this disease. And I found that a lot of what we know, or what we think we know about Encephalitis Lethargica, and as you have commented in our prior conversations, not many people do know about it at all. But those who know about it don't know it properly because they've never seen it. They've never seen a patient with Encephalitis Lethargica. So they've relied on summaries, they've relied on review articles. And the problem is it's a bit like history. When we talk about the origins of World War II, for example, we start with the invasion of Poland in 1939. But of course, a lot of things happen before then. We simplify history as it gets older and older because we can't carry the history of everything in our heads. For a disease, though, if you're going to recognise a disease, you need to know what it looks like exactly. You can't rely on simplified versions. You can't rely on urban myths. And so I decided to do a very detailed history, looking at the symptoms, looking at the neuropathology, looking at what happened to these people in the long term. And that's why my book was so long. And that's how I got into it. I came from dopamine to Parkinson's disease to Encephalitis Lethargica.
Let me ask you, Paul, what determined now working on the second edition of the book, which you published for Springer Publishers about Encephalitis Lethargica? Is it maybe the strong link with COVID? Luckily, or fortunately, several experts do compare, starting from the symptoms to the neuropathological findings, do compare COVID with Encephalitis Lethargica. So all of a sudden, this subject is not more something related to history. It's extremely relevant for our present days. What about your experience, if I may ask, which you made with colleagues of you, and asking you, could you help us finding a better understanding for COVID from what you have found out in your research on Encephalitis Lethargica?
Certainly, there are a lot of similarities, but also differences. One of the misconceptions is that Encephalitis Lethargica was caused by the influenza virus. We won't go into that in detail just now to keep on the line with COVID, but my research has shown that this is very unlikely. We don't know what caused Encephalitis Lethargica. It was probably its own virus. It may still be around. It may have become more harmless, or it may be something which we just take for granted. But the comparison was drawn, well, if influenza caused Encephalitis Lethargica, a long-term disease, maybe COVID will also cause a long-term disease. At first, this was hypothetical, but then, of course, the evidence for the existence of something we now call long COVID became more and more pressing, and people started to worry. Is long COVID something which people will get over in a few months, or is it something which will last for the rest of their lives? Which would be horrendous, both for the individuals and for their families and their friends. And so I've been asked several times right from the start of COVID, what is my opinion on this? What does my research point in this direction? My first answer is that people have forgotten that influenza itself doesn't go away overnight. We now live in a very hectic modern Western civilization where we get the flu, as we call it. We don't even call it influenza anymore. We call it the flu. We get sick for a couple of weeks and then we're recovering and then we go back to work. And people take it for granted that's normal. Back in the 1920s, that wasn't normal. People recognized that if you got the flu, you were sick for 6 months. You should be resting for a long time, not go back to work, because the sooner you went back to work, the more likely you to become sick again. And so in a sense, with COVID, it's the same. If you get COVID, you get very sick for 2 weeks, but then you think, well, I can go back to work now, and your boss says you should go back to work now. You're not as sick anymore. But in fact, you should be taking more time to recover from the full disease. And that's one of the lessons we're also learning, that people who go back to work straight away after having COVID are more likely to have long COVID than people who don't. It's this pushing ourselves back into work, into doing normal things. Modern Western life, it's not healthy. It's not healthy for any disease. And we should remember that next time we have a cold as well. People are saying, for example, in Australia, they're probably saying it in Europe, COVID is just like having the common cold now. You should just go to work and keep working. No, you should stay at home. If you have the common cold, you should stay at home. Don't pass it to your friends. Don't pass it to your workmates. Keep isolated. Get healthy more quickly.
Yeah, people underestimate it.
Exactly. Don't underestimate it. Being sick is not a shame. It's not a weakness. It is a normal part of life. And in fact, older doctors who had to rely on seeing their patients, talking to their patients, not doing 100,000 tests, tended to learn the rhythms of their patients, learn to the rhythms of their life, and would say to them, you're sick, you're feeling a bit down. My first advice is rest, eat properly, but take time off to look after yourself.
But the question whether every flu is severe. So sometimes one may have a spring flu or a summer flu. It may last for a week. But I think Encephalitis Lethargica, it does resemble a flu since it starts with flu-like symptoms. Please do correct me if I'm mistaken. So the potential for confusion is a very huge one.
That's one of the things which people did confuse, because flu-like symptoms tends to be a bit broad anyway. You think of sniffly throat, a sniffly nose, a sore throat, a cough. None of that was seen in Encephalitis Lethargica. What was most similar between influenza and Encephalitis Lethargica was lethargy. And that's what people don't realize these days. People think of the flu, they think of a sore back, they think of the runny nose. In the old days, people thought of influenza as being tired. And in fact, the nervous symptoms of influenza were much more prominent. The headache, the foggy brain, the not being able to concentrate, that was what people thought of influenza. Influenza actually comes from an Italian word, meaning the influence of the stars, because it was so vague. People didn't know what caused it. People didn't know where it was leading. And so a lot of things were piled into influenza, which today we don't think about. Once again, because we say that being foggy-headed, until COVID came along at least, being foggy-headed is not an excuse, is not a disease, it's not a symptom, it's just malingering. Get back to work, concentrate. And in fact, I remember several times in my life, as you probably experienced as well, you've been feeling a bit down and being told by my boss at various stages, get back into work and that's the way you'll get over it. Work through it. That's the way to get over things. You have to ignore disease to conquer it. Not the case at all.
Yeah.
With Encephalitis Lethargica, you did start with this lethargy, but yeah, the flu symptoms, which we think of as flu symptoms now, weren't really there at all.
Sorry for interrupting you. I came across an article from the 20s, and there a physician said that the name itself is most probably the wrong name, because the encephalitis itself cannot be lethargic. Part of the patients may have such symptoms, so obviously experts were not, did not fully accept the name, the way it was defined, let's say by Economa. I came across a webpage owned by the Genetic and Rare Disease Information Center, GARD. It's raredisease.info.nih.gov, so obviously a public page. In there, the Encephalitis Lethargica is presented, and I see they list 28 symptoms. I mean, it covers mainly almost all disciplines of medicine. And they don't express the frequency of the various symptoms in percentages, since there may be some overlapping symptoms. They just say if symptoms were very frequent, less common, and so further, and so on. I mean, what about the difficulties of the experts to deal with so many symptoms? And besides that, I mean, I'm not a physician, but what I have done, I've Googled all the 28 symptoms presented, and I've Googled if such symptoms may be also common in COVID. All of them, none of them was missing.
And in a lot of other diseases as well. That's the problem, that it was very, very vague. And that's one of the problems which people have. They don't recognize that, especially the more common symptoms of the various diseases can come from various sources. So, for example, in Europe, Encephalitis Lethargica, as you say, the name wasn't always accepted. Some people call it epidemic encephalitis. Other people called it the sleeping sickness, especially in Germany. It was called the Schlafkrankheit. That's not the same as the Schlafkrankheit in Africa, which is caused by a known organism and acts in a completely different way. That's a trypanosome, which is a protozoan organism, not a bacterium, but a one-celled organism. And people confuse the two, but they went in completely different directions. This even comes up in popular culture now. So there's Neil Gaiman did a comic series for adults called the Sandman, and he has Encephalitis Lethargica in this story, but he's actually referring to the African sleeping sickness. And of course, I find that annoying, but for the story, it was fine. Go ahead.
Yeah, sorry for interrupting you, because you mentioned the Sandman. There's also a movie at present on TV. I don't know if
the Netflix series, yes.
Exactly. And I did not watch that that movie. I do very seldom watch TV, by the way. But I read several comments about this Sandman, particularly interviews with neurologists, and they say that the Sandman is referring to the Encephalitis Lethargica, which occurred in Europe.
Yes.
So it's almost surprising that during the post-pandemic time of COVID, we have such a movie referring to mythology and referring to somehow similar disease. And something I'd like to point out, in July 2020, the current Minister for Health of Germany, Professor Karl Lauterbach, he's a physician, he pointed on Twitter, and I mean, everybody can read it, he said that in the 20s and 30s, there was a worldwide wave of Encephalitis Lethargica, which was because of the Spanish fly. Now, irrespective if that was correct or not, but that's what he said, and that the brain damage appeared few years after the flu. This is unfortunately not to be excluded in the case of COVID. So that's what he already pointed out at 2020 in July. And I'd like to talk to you about thesis for obtaining the PhD in medicine from 1937, and the author. I will come now across the author. I just prepared the sentence to quote it, and he said that following: a recent follow-up of patients who were thought to have acute encephalitis during the years 1919 and 1920 revealed that those in whose cases the diagnosis was well established were almost all dead or helpless. I mean, that was quite a scaring situation back to the 30s. So obviously it must have affected. The author was Willard Briniger, and this thesis was submitted 1937. So obviously 1937, let's say in the mid-30s, Encephalitis Lethargica and Parkinsonism was a serious social health issue.
Very frightening and very prominent. Everybody was aware of it, The number of people affected, it's hard to say because medicine was different in those days. As I said, there was no blood test for it, so you couldn't establish it. But it is actually one of the myths which you often read, that 1/3 of the patients died during the acute phase, 1/3 developed Parkinsonism, and 1/3 recovered completely. That's because earlier reviews were based on surveys done in around about 1924. When I did the same as this doctoral thesis person, except of course from a much later viewpoint, I found nobody recovered. If you had encephalitis lethargica, you were doomed to Parkinsonism at some point, and it could wait. And that was the frightening thing, which I think you're referring to, that some people moved directly from acute encephalitis lethargica, which was bad enough with the fever, the lethargy, the catatonia, but then they could recover for maybe days, but in many cases for 10, 15, 20 years. And then suddenly the Parkinsonism started to develop. And Parkinsonism, as I can relate from my own family's experience, is a terrible disorder, but it usually evolves slowly. In these people, it evolved over a course of 2, 3, 4 years. So you suddenly had a 25-year-old, a 35-year-old, a 45-year-old who looked, for all intents and purposes, as we've seen in the film Awakenings, frozen within themselves. And that sort of impact can't be overlooked. And it did have an impact on people at the time. It turns up in all sorts of interesting places, in novels. It's also tragic because we are talking about the 1930s when this starts, the 1920s. There are no nursing homes. So these young people, some of them as young as 18, are being sent to old persons' homes to spend the rest of their lives because there is nowhere else for them to go.
Now, in addition to the public health impact, I think it had also a wide impact because of sometimes extremely aggressive behavior on the criminal law, on the newly passed laws for mental health acts. So apparently societies try to compete and to deal with this phenomenon at a certain extent, since youth was also affected by symptoms described with extreme aggression. I mean, you describe properly such symptoms, psychiatric symptoms, in the conversation, which is an article which I recommend to our audience. You've written back to 2011, a viral infection of the mind, the curious case of Encephalitis Lethargica. Do you think that there might be also a link between this aggression, the cognitive decline in the mind of, let's say, a younger generation, and sympathies for radical political movements? Might this Encephalitis Lethargica have influenced political radicalism, let's say, across the world?
It might have made a minor contribution, but it mostly, in terms of behaviour, it really affected children and adolescents by basically releasing them from all their inhibitions. So they were very impulsive. This usually resulted in mischievous behaviour, but this mischievous behaviour could rank up to things such as assault, murder, even rape. And this could continue into early adulthood as long as the Parkinsonism hadn't been developed. The Parkinsonism actually put something of a brake on these emotional outbursts, although of course they were still happening inside their head. It's just that they can no longer execute them. I have read something which was a publication in America, which suggested that Encephalitis Lethargica may have contributed to the rise of National Socialism in Germany, for example. But I think there are lots of other reasons why that arose. And it also overlooks the fact that there was more Encephalitis Lethargica in a place like England than in Germany. And extremism didn't arise, well, not to the same extent. It did arise to a certain degree. Or in America, of course.
Or Australia.
Yeah, it certainly would have contributed. It contributed to the if you like, the feeling of the age. And some people have written about this idea that the 20s were a period of nervousness, and neurologists and psychiatrists were very prominent at this stage, writing about the idea that the world seemed to be falling apart in very different ways, economically, politically. And some of them, for example, McNulty in England, noted that polio, Encephalitis Lethargica, various forms of meningitis were all on the rise. And it seemed as if the modern age was too much for the human brain. And maybe the human brain would have to adapt to an era in which it was assaulted by various diseases simply because we hadn't evolved to deal with working very hard, celebrating all night long instead of going to bed. The idea that World War I, itself had been a major trauma, a major shock. Freud, of course, had started World War I very optimistic, and by the end of World War I, is introducing the idea of the death wish, the idea that death played a major role in our consciousness, which he hadn't seen before. So in a sense, I wouldn't blame Hitler on Encephalitis Lethargica, but certainly Encephalitis Lethargica as something in the cultural background didn't help to make people feel any more confident about the future.
What I have seen and read through, because I need to prepare myself for this interview, is that scientists really took it seriously investigating Encephalitis Lethargica back then. I mean, it was they've realized that it is a very complex disease, and from its initial description, this disease challenged actually the existing understanding of neurology, psychiatry, neurophysiology, neuropathology, actually in multiple areas, including disease classification, then the state of alertness, the phenomenology of sleep and consciousness, even to the extent of new endocrine symptoms, which then in turn affected sexual misconduct and a changed sexual behavior among the youth. I mean, so obviously this disease did severe damage to the brain, somehow as if it was a very specific localized injury in the brainstem which induces all these changes.
Yes, certainly in the English-speaking countries of the time, psychiatry and neurology had started going different directions. And the idea was that psychiatry, you couldn't see anything in the brain; neurology, you could see things. So Alzheimer's, for example, was definitely a neurological disease, despite the fact that it has to do with memory, because you could see these plaques within the brain. What Encephalitis Lethargica showed, and Economo talked about this, and even more, somebody whose name I would like to mention, Felix Stan, a Jewish neurologist who unfortunately suffered because of his being Jewish towards the end of the Encephalitis Lethargica period. What they emphasised was that this showed that the brain was responsible for everything, that you don't have damage to the brain causing neurological disease, which doesn't have psychiatric consequences. Hysteria was a very important concept at the time. Some people thought hysteria was, as we would say, all in the mind, but hysterical symptoms could be produced by Encephalitis Lethargica. So people started to think, well, maybe hysteria is not all about being weak or about being a woman or having been shell-shocked during World War I. Perhaps there's something happening in the brain there. Some people developed symptoms which looked like what we now call schizophrenia. And previously that was also thought to be the result of something happening in the mind, but not in the brain itself. Encephalitis Lethargica showed something which my German colleagues still say today, that when you open up the brain, you don't find neurons and cycons, you only find neurons. Everything relies on these nerve cells. And as it turns out, it's the system which is important. For something like Parkinson's disease and Parkinsonism, which is seen in Encephalitis Lethargica, one particular part of the brain is involved, the substantia nigra. And that's clear, that's simple, although not simple enough to cure. Even today, we can't do that. We have drugs to help people, but we can't cure the disease. Psychiatry is a bit more complicated because we're talking about a more global function of the brain. And Encephalitis Lethargica showed something which a lot of people still don't realise. Psychiatric disease, psychological disease is not about one part malfunctioning. It's about the whole not working together to produce the consciousness and the awareness which we consider to be normal. And that's where psychiatry is complicated. It's why when you have, for example, an antidepressant drug, it is not like insulin, which we know what it does in the body. Insulin helps you deal with sugar properly. We don't know. We know various things that an antidepressant does in the brain, but we don't know why it helps with depression. We basically use it the way people used atropine in the past for treating Parkinsonism because it works.
I'd like to know if EL was a sort of framing disease, if people were, let's say, categorized back then because of this disease or because of their symptoms. And what is the potential for discrimination nowadays? Obviously, discrimination wasn't such a social or legal aspect, since maybe the society wasn't that emancipated back then. But what's the potential for framing and a discriminating disease?
It was a very strange disease, and it was treated differently in different social milieus. So, for example, with the children with encephalitis lethargica, they could actually be, as I say, very boisterous, very impulsive. And in a working class family where you already are living in close quarters with each other, there may be 10 children as well as the parents and the grandparents. This was obviously very socially disrupting. And as a result, a lot of parents felt the need to give their children with encephalitis lethargica up to insane asylums or to other avenues of care because they couldn't look after themselves and to go to work. In other cases, it was more about embarrassment. So when I started talking to people whose parents or grandparents had encephalitis lethargica in Australia, I'd actually originally put an ad in the paper about, I want to hear your stories. And as it turns out, a lot of these people didn't even know the name encephalitis lethargica, but they said, we did have this aunt who was always in the back room in her bed, and we never talked to her, we never visited her, we took the food in and went away. I don't even know what happened to her in the end. And that was also something which could happen, that people would be locked away because there was some embarrassment to the family because here was a disease where they were not recovering. But in many cases, they looked okay. The Parkinsonism may be bad, but other people have Parkinson's disease. You don't need to lock them away. So certainly there was a source of embarrassment there which could lead to discrimination. With respect to the law, ironically, in many countries, the laws were a lot stricter in those days in terms of what we do with juvenile delinquents and lawbreakers. But encephalitis lethargica actually started a change across Europe, especially. Not so much
the criminal culpability.
To actually introduce recognition in the criminal code that a disease could make you do things which were criminal, but in that case, they were not criminal because you had no control over yourself. The idea that somebody could be not criminally insane, but disinhibited to such an extent you could not control your knowledge of good and evil, which we take for granted these days, that, for example, a child or a young person, even a young adult, might do something in the heat of the moment. It doesn't make them a bad person. It makes them somebody who needs to be rehabilitated and trained and helped and maybe medically treated as well. Before the 1920s, that wasn't the case. These people would have been locked away in jail permanently. And the ironic thing was that I actually found that these humanisation of the law efforts even took places in countries which were not expected. including Nazi Germany and Communist Russia. In both countries where there was a lot of talk at the time about young people running riot and they needed to be brought under control because they weren't being respectful anymore. At the same time, they recognised that at least a subgroup of these people had no control over what they were doing. And even during the worst times of Nazi Germany, these people enjoyed, well, not enjoyed, but at least had a little bit of protection against what was happening to a lot of their family members and community members who were being, the word at the time was euthanized, but they were being murdered in mental institutions.
Because you mentioned in your answer related to my question, if it was a framing disease, you said that somehow it was embarrassing for family members to admit that some members have suffered of EL. Surprisingly, I came across the Magic Mountain, Thomas Mann's famous novel, deals about this asylum in Davos where people suffering of tuberculosis were treated. So we all had to read in Germany this, the Magic Mountain. I don't know if it's also that famous in Australia, but the Magic Mountain is a very famous novel written by Thomas Mann. Now, make a long story short, Professor Fiercho, a pneumologist, the last director of this institution, of this asylum, where mainly rich people were treated. He, as a young doctor, made the radiology of Mann's wife, of Karin Mann. And Professor Fiercho, unfortunately, passed away a couple of years ago. In a speech in 1994, he says that this institution, which he actually had closed down, was a place of myth and experiments, and that he said he commented the radiography which he made of the lungs of Karin Mann and said no traces whatsoever of tuberculosis. So I invited his son, who's also a professor for pneumology, in an interview. I'm still awaiting to schedule another interesting interview on that, because my question is, if maybe because of this shaming, because of this embarrassment, if the Magic Mountain was actually an institution for, because sleep was a sort of mythology, it had a mystical aspect in this institution. If it was not tuberculosis, if it was maybe rather, but purely speculative, my question, if it was not rather Encephalitis Lethargica as the prevailing disease for rich people in this asylum in Davos. No idea.
I couldn't really comment either, especially on the basis of a novel which I've read and very much enjoyed myself. But yeah, certainly, because it was so hard to define. And as I say, depending on your social background, your economic resources, what you could do with it. Tuberculosis is a good example. You talk about it being a bit mythic. Tuberculosis was a terrible disease, the leading cause of death for men under 25 during the 1920s. But somehow it also had this romanticism about it. Poets had tuberculosis and died of it with a little spot of blood on the handkerchief and whatever. Encephalitis Lethargica never really achieved that. It was probably too rough. But at the same time, in terms of social impact, it was interesting because, for example, crime was considered to be, in the early part of the 20th century, a matter of bad upbringing, a bad social milieu. The working class become criminals, the rich don't. And suddenly, rich people, because Encephalitis Lethargica affected rich people as much as poor people, suddenly had children or adolescents or young men and women doing terrible things. And this made it clear that maybe criminal behaviour is not all about bad manners or bad upbringing. There are other aspects as well which we have to take into account. And perhaps they said, well, maybe poor people become criminals because they have no choice. But we've just learned from Encephalitis Lethargica that there can also be medical reasons why people don't behave the way we want them to. You must remember at this stage, of course, that people with epilepsy were also incarcerated in insane asylums because it was considered that they had a terrible disease, which meant they had to be locked away from society. It was a case of, to a large extent, of people didn't want to see these people. So let's put them somewhere where we can't see them. We'll look after them to the best of our capabilities, but we can't treat them, so we don't want to see them. They're embarrassing. Cancer was the same.
Actually, narratives, but also new definitions or different names, actually, of EL in history make this understanding, as we said at the beginning of our discussion, of this disease so difficult. And actually, for the audience who maybe are not familiar with Professor Oliver Sacks and the author, I have the German version of the book here, A Way of the Awakenings. I particularly enjoyed reading about the history of the sleeping disease. And I don't know if you ever met Professor Sacks. I think he passed away 2015. He spoke about this almost mysterious disease, which apparently occurs every couple of centuries, always under a different name. And that each new generation of, particularly of physicians, is facing its difficulties to understand the disease. Why do you think this disease might have a mystical aspect, now related to what Professor Oliver Sacks in Awakenings was writing?
There are several reasons. The fact is that sleep for all of us is very important, very desirable. I was just reading an article today in the New Yorker about the problems of concentration, and they were talking about monks, the various strategies they've had over the centuries, and this was about medieval times, about concentrating. And some tried not to sleep at all. Others thought that sleeping was good for enhancing concentration. I think we'd agree, most of us, that sleeping is really important for a happy life, for a comfortable life. And I think one of the reasons we appreciated the upside of the COVID pandemic in many cases was that the lockdowns meant that we had to work from home for those of us who could, and that meant sleeping a little bit longer. So we weren't going to work on the bus tired and upset and flustered. And that's why so many of us still like the idea of working at home, as I did today, because we get into our work in a much more energetic way. There's also the fact that you go through history. You can talk about the Bible, you can talk about Greek mythology, you can talk about Christian history. We were talking earlier about Nordic history and Germanic history. There are always stories about people who've either slept for a long time or not slept at all. Even in America, you have frontier stories about somebody who died, who slept for 20 years and wakes up. There is just something mystical about sleep, the experience of sleep, the dreams, and the fact that there is a disease that comes along and puts you to sleep is rather mystical, rather romantic. Of course, what follows from that, the death, is not so romantic. The Parkinson's disease are not so romantic. And that's why our sleep for a long time has been known as the little brother of death, because we seem to feel that in sleep we have access to what death might be about, because we're free from our bodies. We are free to do things which we can't do while we're awake. But at least with sleep, we come back here. We're not quite prepared to go through that final door yet, or at least not most of us are. And that's what makes any disease which has sleep involved in it a bit romantic. And if you look at all the pictures as well, I'm always amused by some of the articles which were published during the time of Encephalitis Lethargica of people during the lethargic phase, because they all just look like people sleeping. And nobody, when they're asleep, looks angry or upset or depressed. Everybody looks happy.
Yeah, I think it's very important, the aspect you pointed out at related to sleep disturbances, which include the insomnia, then the non-restorative sleep, the sleep schedule disorder, excessive daytime somnolence, sleep apnea, and restlessness. So it's not just sleeping too much, it's not sleeping at all, and restlessness. They all belong together and are related to sleep disturbances. And it's funny, we encounter, particularly in Germanic mythology, the sleep as a sort of punishment, which these gods, particularly Odin, is inoculating either to Brunhilde, the sleeping beauty. We are always meeting in this mythology the sleep as a punishment. We have again a punishment in Odin's curse, another syndrome in neurology, which we again, once more encounter in COVID. Undine was a water nymph, and this Undine puts a spell on her husband who betrays her, and again he falls asleep. So obviously this sleep is touches a mystical dimension, but it's also an instrument of punishment in some cultures. And I think a punishment implies that someone might do it, premeditate the sleep in order to change, let's say, a society, or to punish someone who did something wrong.
Yes, yeah. Sleep it works in all different directions. Sleep can be a reward. There's the famous story of the 7 sleepers of Ephesus, for example, who I think lived during the persecution of Domitian, the Roman emperor. And their reward was to escape to a cave and fall asleep and then wake up 20 years later and the emperor's dead and Christianity has triumphed. And I think that's the dream world is always good there. You talked about Sleeping Beauty being put to sleep as a sort of a punishment, or a punishment of her family that she is put to sleep, the pricking of a thumb. But then, of course, she wakes up to Prince Charming, who makes everything good again. The castle comes back to life. She is happy and married. And sleep and dreams, the two going together, have a huge cultural significance, which is why when I hear people who tell me they don't dream or they can't remember their dreams, I think how horrible. I mean, I do remember my dreams, and they're not things I write down. They're not things I share with people usually, but I think they help me get through life because they are. I don't even know if they do have a function, but they make me feel better. It's like a good novel. A good novel doesn't have to be educative, but it makes life more pleasant, like lots of things do.
I consider personally my dreams as a source of inspiration. I really love dreaming.
Yes.
Particularly the latest dreams in course of the night seem to be, for me personally, extremely inspiring. Once I wake up, I feel like taking a piece of paper and write the things down because I really appreciate what came into my mind. So it's something really I enjoy a lot. So one last question, Paul. Did scientists during this EL pandemic ever give a thought that they might have been, that people or society might have been dealing with a sort of bioweapon?
Not really. And the reason for that would be that you need to remember this time. I wrote about the Encephalitis Lethargica pandemic being caused by a virus. And the word virus was used at the time, but it meant something a little bit different to what we mean today. Virchow and Pasteur and all these other people in the 19th century discovered bacteria. And it was assumed that all diseases were caused by bacteria or something similar. Ironically, the first disease, which we now know wasn't caused by a bacterium, but it's caused by a virus, was in plants, the tobacco mosaic virus, probably the most common virus on the planet, according to some reports, which we could talk about another time. But yes, people couldn't conceive of something like Encephalitis Lethargica being caused being caused by something which could be controlled as a weapon, simply because they didn't understand what causes diseases themselves. Karl Landsteiner had discovered, in inverted commas, the polio virus a little bit before Encephalitis Lethargica, but he didn't discover it in the way we know today, where you could have a test tube and say, here I have the crystallized virus. He basically had a fluid which he'd filtered to remove possible bacteria, contaminants, and he knew that he could use this fluid to infect other animals and cause polio. And that's how they knew viruses at that stage. People talked about influenza being caused by a virus, but that virus wouldn't be discovered until 1933 or so. And that was a lot more difficult because it turns out the influenza virus needed a bacterium as a helper to cause disease in a particular animal. So for a long time, that was also a puzzle. So using bioweapons at that stage in terms of something which you could use like a poison was a bit beyond their possibilities. It didn't mean, of course, that bioweapons weren't possible, because bioweapons have been used for ages, putting dead animals into water sources, for example, or it's suspected, for example, that the Black Death was brought to Europe because a besieged town on the Crimea had cast infected animals onto the besiegers, and then these besiegers had come to Europe infected with the Black Death. Bioweapons have been around for a while, but they're a bit cruder than we're now capable of.
The media, the Italian media and the American newspapers speculated if the Spanish flu might have been a bioweapon, and there was a sort of political action. I interviewed Professor Howard Phillips from the University of Cape Town, a very famous historian.
Yes.
In the Spanish flu. He wrote his PhD in 1980 in London about the Spanish flu in South Africa. And there was a sort of censorship during these days in South Africa. Physicians who believed that it was not a flu. They were actually not really allowed to talk about that. So, and governments in general, that's what he said, did not want to accept the idea of a biological weapon, because then they will show that they are at some extent vulnerable against disease. So everybody preferred the flu scenario, the flu narrative, in comparison to the narrative of the Encephalitis Lethargica. But related to a possible co-infection, a very interesting paper from 1919 written by Professor Peter Basoi in American Medical Journal. He said, the author of this article, he said that epidemic encephalitis, or nona, he compared it with another episode of this disease.
Back in the 1890s.
He said the encephalitis may itself be a cerebral form of influenza, or it may be caused by a separate virus, which in order to become active must have been in contact at one time or another with that of influenza. So I think he gave a very thorough thought. What if there might be another virus, unknown virus, causing all the symptoms?
Yes, there were several thoughts followed at the time, some of which led to dead ends. One early idea that it was caused by streptococcus, the same thing which causes sore throats. That didn't turn out to be the case, although if you look at the data in England, there was a slight association of the epidemiology with that of scarlet fever, which is caused by streptococcus. And that's always a problem. If you look at one country, okay, it looks like streptococcus. In Italy, Encephalitis Lethargica came with the last, if you like, the last spring of the Spanish influenza in 1920. And so in Italy, everybody said Encephalitis Lethargica was caused by influenza. Whereas the Germans said, well, we had Encephalitis Lethargica first and then we had the flu. So that doesn't make sense. I think the idea that maybe a couple of things were going on at the same time probably makes a lot of sense. And people were talking about this for influenza as well. Because one of the interesting things is that the H1N1 influenza virus, which caused the Spanish influenza, is the same one which came back several times since, including just over 10 years ago. But at the same time, doesn't cause the same amount of havoc in the world which it did the first time. And the suggestion is that perhaps the influenza virus itself wasn't so deadly, although deadly enough, but in combination with bacterial infections was especially deadly. That goes along with the African experience of the Spanish influenza, where the death toll was mighty. I've read some estimates of 2% of the population in Africa died of the Spanish influenza, and the death toll was very heavy in India as well. Both countries at that stage, which, to put it tactfully, were undeveloped in terms of medicine, and therefore more exposed than European countries. You often hear, for example, that it was called the Spanish influenza because Spain could talk about it. They weren't in the war. There was no censorship. But in fact, Spain was probably the worst affected country in Europe by the Spanish influenza. Italy followed closely, and then it got weaker as it went towards the north, which also goes along with the advancements in medicine as you go from south to north. In the most recent influenza pandemic, deaths were greatest in Australia, in Indigenous communities where health is very much a problem. And in North America and in Europe, it was in people who also had lesser access to good healthcare. So the idea that there might be multiple organisms involved in a pandemic is also very important. And we find that during COVID as well, of course, not necessarily that there are different organisms, but we know that COVID has different effects and more drastic effects in people with pre-existing medical conditions. And that's something we in the West tend to forget. We tend to think that, well, the flu is a virus, I'll get the jab, I'm fine, and I'll never be exposed to a pandemic, I'll never be exposed to an infectious disease, and I'll never get sick. Unfortunately, life is an accumulation of insults and accumulation of risks. And sometimes a couple come together which prove to be fatal or at least debilitating. That could certainly apply to Encephalitis Lethargica. The fact that influenza played the deciding role, I'm not so sure about. But the fact that if you had the Spanish flu, you're more likely to get Encephalitis Lethargica, yes, I could agree with that. I think if you have Encephalitis Lethargica, if you had the flu at that stage, you're more likely to get a lot of diseases, which of course we don't worry about now because we're vaccinated against them.
Well, maybe some sort of irritation of the lungs might be necessary for a different virus to enter the cells.
Irritation of the lungs, or it can be that we can only deal with a couple of infections at a time. We tend to forget that, which is what I came across when I was doing this research, that during the 1920s, even in a place like Sydney, which was, it's a Western country, had the best level of medicine which is available in the world at that stage, tens of thousands of children were still dying of things like diphtheria and scarlet fever and measles and mumps. And so when you look at somebody's medical history who had Encephalitis Lethargica, they had all these diseases which they'd already survived. And so maybe this was just the final insult. Whereas when for example, I've had COVID twice over the last couple of years. And when people look at my medical history, they won't find any other diseases beforehand. So no wonder I survive. Whereas somebody who's already had a few things, or maybe only one thing, which is important, they don't do as well. They end up in intensive care and perhaps worse. We tend to forget as Westerners that things don't come one at a time, that we don't control our lives 100%. That the world is a very challenging place to live, even under the best of circumstances.
Well, it is challenging, and at least with such interviews and debates like ours, living with such challenges may be more interesting, at least understanding potentially a mechanism working in the background. But please, Paul, if you allow me one last question.
Certainly.
Professor Wilenski and Leslie Hoffman, Joel Wilenski,
Yep.
published a paper 2017, Encephalitis Lethargica, 100 years after the epidemic, published in Oxford academic papers. And there we talk about the prevalence of this disease among certain ethnic groups. And I'd like to quote, some reports also suggested a higher prevalence of Encephalitis Lethargica among Jews and among natives in South Africa, India, and the Philippines. There were higher incidences of Encephalitis Lethargica in large cities and industrial centers than in rural areas. However, this may be due to these areas having larger populations and better diagnostic facilities than rural areas.
Yep, I would, with the urban country difference, I would agree with that. Although it's interesting, one of the diseases which Encephalitis Lethargica was compared with was polio. And people worked out how polio is transmitted, ironically, because Swedish scientists looked at it in isolated villages where they could follow the virus from person to person. And that's when they realized, for example, that most people who are infected with polio don't have symptoms. And so you had to have these isolated groups where it could be followed closely to work out the chain of infections which had occurred and to predict what was happening. Encephalitis Lethargica may have been the same, but certainly it seemed to be more prevalent in larger cities. But that's also where you have the larger medical centres, the more concentrated attention on how things are doing, and to be frank, where people care. I can speak more for Australia than for Europe, of course. But people here certainly complain that medical services in our more remote areas are very substandard compared with what you get in the city. And if somebody were to fall sick, for example, in the country with Encephalitis Lethargica, maybe they just stayed at home. Maybe they were the aunt who was put in the back room to vegetate, whereas in the city they would be taken to a clinic. As I said, it certainly didn't seem to discriminate between the rich and the poor. The rich could afford better care, although there was never a cure for it. I have read about the higher incidence amongst Jewish people, particularly in Russia and
yeah,
later
exactly.
Soviet Union.
Wilenski co-authored, sorry for interrupting, another article about the Encephalitis Lethargica in Soviet Russia, and there was another Russian scientist, and there he again pointed out at the higher prevalence among Jews. Unfortunately, he was unavailable for an interview because he says literally some reports also suggested a higher prevalence of Encephalitis Lethargica among Jews and among natives in South Africa. He answered me off the record that it was because of the infrastructure of Jewish hospitals. He said that Professor Oliver Sacks was himself a Jew and most hospitals were Jewish. And I answered him, okay, well, this might apply in terms of a certain access to medical infrastructure, but it does definitely not apply to natives in South Africa, which were unprivileged and really discriminated against because of apartheid back to the beginning of the 20th century. So there is an obviously an ethnic prevalence which cannot be explained with a medical infrastructure available for both mentioned groups by Professor Wilenski, which one was, let's say, had a better access to medical infrastructure and the other one no access at all.
That would be factors. I mean, in Germany as well, neurology, especially in Berlin, I'll say it was dominated by Jewish doctors, and I don't mean that in a bad way. It's just that a large number of neurologists were Jewish, and so it was part of their focus, I guess. And that's why I say when we look at things in a certain country, that can explain things. So in Germany, that works as an explanation. In Russia, a lot of, especially in that in the Western area there, a lot of the doctors were Jewish as well, so they would be very well aware of it. and that works as an explanation there. But as you say, that doesn't work in South Africa. It doesn't work in certain other countries for where these things are. And there may have been a genetic factor which is involved in susceptibility, which we now know is involved in most things, whether you're talking about susceptibility to diabetes or susceptibility to Alzheimer's disease. Genetics and the environment interact in complex ways, which it takes huge numbers of patients, huge data to finally recognise. And unfortunately, Encephalitis Lethargica happened at a time when those numbers weren't collected, and the data we would like to collect, such as genetic information, wasn't collected. So that'll always be speculative. South Africa, I couldn't explain, but yeah, we keep coming across these tantalising hints in various countries, but they don't fit together to a picture yet. And there's certainly more room for research there to try and at least find a common thread where this might go, or what happened to Encephalitis Lethargica in the end. One possibility is that Encephalitis Lethargica continued to circulate throughout the world in a more benign form, which might cause something, for example, more similar to chronic fatigue syndrome, which once again brings us back to the link with COVID-19.
That's right.
That not all there are lots of viruses in the world we don't even know about because they don't cause a disease in human beings or in animals we care about or in plants we care about. Viruses are where life on Earth started before evolving into more complex organisms. And the fact is, once a virus stops causing something we care about, it just sits there in the background, maybe doing things we don't even know about. Maybe it's causing things like diabetes, maybe it's causing something else. You just never know, because unless it causes something dramatic, something which means that people stand up and take notice, and or ideally causes an epidemic which makes people scared, those viruses just vegetate happily without us noticing them.
You know, now we came to the end of this interview. Why I'm so fascinated about your research related to Encephalitis Lethargica, because the more neurologists compare nowadays COVID with Encephalitis Lethargica, we are really on some giants. Yeah, they are basically giants in the history of medicine who did well explain this very seldom and unusual disease. There's even an article standing on the shoulder of giants, 100 years of neurology and epidemic infections, written by Harriet van den Toorn and et al. I think the more neurologists compare COVID with lethargic encephalitis, the less relevant is a complex laboratory like, let's say, Wuhan, looking at the origin of COVID. Then it might explain that maybe a much more rudimentary, simple and basic mechanism of inducing a co-infection might have produced Encephalitis Lethargica, might have produced Nona, another similar disease at the end of the 19th century. So I think your research and of colleagues of you engaged in Encephalitis Lethargica is an extremely important contribution in finding sooner or later the final answer on the origin of COVID. And
that's why I'm most proud of having produced that history. As you say, a lot of people have compared COVID and Encephalitis Lethargica in terms of its long-term effects, but they're usually comparing COVID with a watered-down version of Encephalitis Lethargica, which they've learned through review articles, which in many cases have perpetuated urban myths about the disease. I wanted to set in stone a few years ago now what it was really like, what the details were, because medicine is always about the details. And the more knowledge you have about what has happened in the past, I think that's better for the future. During my time in Europe, I was always pleased to encounter so many physicians, so many scientists who had an interest in the histories of their fields, because I think without those backgrounds, if you think medicine started with PubMed, you're chopping off a great deal of information which could be of future importance, or could be of importance now, because the Alzheimer's, the Parkinson's, the Creutzfeldts, the Jacobs, all these, the Pasteurs, they were not idiots. They contributed the basis of what we have now, and to forget that is problematic.
It will be definitely worthwhile talking one day about Creutzfeld. Well,
Yes.
He, the very famous neuropathologist, one of his hobbies was the tobacco mosaic virus. And his father-in-law was a hideous Nazi economist, and I wonder why he gets still quoted, Werner Sombart.
Okay.
Such a hideous scientist. One of his first publications was about the role of Jews in modern capitalism. That's a complete no-go that such a hideous person like Sombart gets quoted even nowadays. And I do recommend to all our readers, never tolerate even a nowadays scientist quoting Werner Sombart, because Sombart came up with the idea of sustainability in a society.
Yes.
So, but because he discriminated between the Sylvanists, the people of the north, and the Saharists, actually the Jewish population, somehow surprisingly that his son-in-law, Creutzfeld, was so fond of the tobacco mosaic virus. That may be plain coincidence, but because it's maybe plain coincidence today, it's definitely a topic which I'd like to investigate in future, and particularly what did Professor Creutzfeld do in the era of Papua?
Yes.
Well, thank you very much for having joined us here on Cotidianul TV. Wishing you a wonderful evening in Australia and hope to see you soon.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
My pleasure. Bye.
Thank you.